So the first topic we're really going to talk about in this class is death. I know, nice, cheery way to start the semester, right? But I have a few reasons for this. One, I think it is an interesting topic. It's something that should interest you, right? I don't know, a lot of this depends on your age. I remember when I was like 20-something, I'm like, yes, an abstract that is interesting. But of course, that happens to other people, not me, right? Rolling into my 40s starts to seem to be something that applies to me a bit more, right? But, if we're honest, it's something that's going to happen to every human being. It's something worth thinking about, right? It's part of the human condition. If philosophy is really going to be relevant, this is something it ought to take up. I also think that in talking about death and in arguments about death, we introduce some really interesting philosophical questions. And the biggest of these will be, Socrates says, well, death can't harm a good person. And he has some assumptions for this, but some of the philosophers we're going to look at, the Epicureans, pick up this idea, and they try to develop Socrates' argument. And when we start to look at the way they do this, I think it raises really important, really interesting questions about what it is to benefit or harm someone, what it is that makes our lives go badly, what is good or bad for us. And we'll see the Epicureans have some very specific assumptions about this. And on the face of it, they're plausible assumptions, but when we push them harder, maybe we will need a wider, better picture of what makes our lives go well or badly. Okay, so that is my sort of, motivation for starting to talk about this. Let's get into the subject. Now, Socrates in the Apology makes a rather startling argument. He says he's not afraid of death, right? And he says that no good person should be afraid of death. And he gives something like the following argument, right? He doesn't distill it. He doesn't put it in this numbered premises and conclusion form, but he does offer us this argument. Either death is the end of all experience, or there's an afterlife where good people are rewarded. Remember, he says, well, to me, death seems like it'll be one of two things. If death is the end of all experience, then it isn't bad for anyone. We'll talk about his argument for two in a minute, but, he says, well, if it's the end of all experience, it's like a dreamless sleep. Why would you fear that, right? Or the other side of this, statement, if there is an afterlife where good people are rewarded, then death is not an evil for a good person, right? If two's right, it's not bad for anybody because it's just the end. If three's right and there is an afterlife, well, Socrates thinks who knows about bad people, but at least good people will be rewarded. So Socrates says, death is not an evil for a good person. He doesn't see any way that it could be bad for a good person. And he seems pretty confident that he is in fact a good person. So he says, I'm not afraid of death. Now look, I don't want to focus on three. Or one, the first part, the second part of one about good people being rewarded in the afterlife, right? Socrates, this is actually a pretty shocking statement for somebody like Socrates. The Greeks did not, as a whole, believe this when he wrote this, right? If you look at the Odyssey, when it portrays the underworld, the afterlife, the Greek view was that the afterlife kind of stinks for everybody, right? You get all the heroes whining to Odysseus how much it stinks to be dead, right? But Socrates just seems to be pretty confident that, well, if there's an afterlife, it's good for good people. He doesn't really defend that. It just seems to be a big assumption. But what I want to talk about is two. This is what the Epicureans are going to pick up. They're going to say, well, look, if death is the end of all experience, then death is not bad for anyone. And what they're going to try to show is they're going to say, well, look, there's no afterlife. Death is the end of all experience. We're not going to look at the Epicurean arguments for this right now. We'll talk about them a little bit more in the section on personal identity. But they'll say, well, look, if death is the end, can't be bad. We'll show you death is the end, so you shouldn't be afraid of it. So let's think about this premise 2. If death is the end of all experience, then death is not bad for anyone. There's no afterlife, no hope of survival. You shouldn't fear death. Well, do we accept premise 2? Is premise 2 something that is obviously true that everyone would accept? No, of course not, right? It's not just that premise 2 is controversial. Premise 2 is downright shocking, right? Most people who are afraid of death, at least it seems to me, and I think that's practically everyone to some degree on some level, that's what they're afraid of, right? Look, it's the end, no more me, no more experience, poof, gone, fade to whatever, right? Fade to black. Curtain falls, that's it. That's what people find terrifying. And now you want to say, well, if it's the end, that means it's not scary. Premise 2 not only seems controversial, it seems downright, to many people, it would seem crazy, right? No, this is precisely what we fear about death. It is the end, that's it, right? So, definitely, given how controversial premise 2 is, it needs an argument, right? Premise 2 is super interesting, but the more interesting your claims are, generally the more controversial they are, the more they stand in need of some kind of argument. So what kind of argument can we give for premise 2? Socrates gives one, right? And it's one that at first glance might seem convincing. If death is the end of all experience, then death is like a dreamless sleep. So if a dreamless sleep is not a bad thing, then the end of all experience is not a bad thing. A dreamless sleep is not a bad thing. So the end of all experience is not a bad thing. You are not terrified when you go to sleep at night. Oh my goodness, unconsciousness isn't that terrible. You just do it. In fact, a lot of us like a good night's sleep. So if we're not afraid of a good night's sleep, if death is like that, then why would we be afraid of death? Now, interestingly, it actually turns out that practically no sleep is dreamless, right? I mean, periods of sleep are dreamless, but normal sleep, the whole night, you have periods of dreaming. It's kind of freaky, even though we don't remember it. We are having experience of some sort most of the time, or at least a lot of the time we're asleep, right? You only really have dreamless sleep if something's wrong, or, you take some kind of powerful tranquilizer. Actually, if your sleep is dreamless, we now think that dreams are the main reason we sleep. You're going to wake up tired, feeling terrible. Anyway, Socrates didn't know that, so we might say, well, Socrates, I don't know. But I think there's a more fundamental issue here, right? Look, a period of unconsciousness doesn't seem to be a bad thing, right? If someone knocks you out for an operation or procedure, we don't think the unconsciousness in and of itself is a bad thing, right? Certainly better than experiencing like the surgery conscious, right? And, some part of our sleep is dreamless. We don't think that's a bad thing. So, to the extent that death is just the absence of experience, we don't fear other periods of unconsciousness or missing experience. Why should we fear death? Think about this argument. Do you accept the premises? That's always when you distill an argument, if it's in fact a valid argument, and I think this one is, what we should do is ask, are the premises good? Do we accept them or not? And if we don't accept them, which premises do we not accept? Do we find suspect? I've already put a little pressure on it, but I think the big one here is 1. If death is the end of all experience, is it really like a dreamless sleep? Are these two, assuming death is the end of all experience, which we'll just assume for the time being, are these two similar? Arguments by analogy of this sort, this thing is like that thing, we have this attitude toward the one thing, so if they're similar, we should view them the same way. Other sorts of argument by analogy too, things being alike. We go from, something we think of one to the other. These are very common, right? But we always have to ask ourselves, are the things really alike in the way the argument claims? So if death is the end of all experience, how might it be different from a dreamless sleep? Well, the big thing here is the two do seem different, and they seem different because a dreamless sleep or a period of unconsciousness, they put you under for surgery or whatever. What makes it not bad is it's temporary. Not only is it temporary, it tends to be pretty short, right? When we go to sleep for 8 hours, I forget how much of that time is dreamless sleep, but only part of it is. But even if it were all, it's only 8 hours, right? If they put you under for a surgery, it's usually only a few hours, right? So what makes unconsciousness not bad is that it's temporary. Not just that it's temporary, but it's usually a pretty short period of time. And think about this, right? If the period of unconsciousness is a long time, is it still so clear it's a bad thing, right? Or not a bad thing, right? Think about this. If someone said, okay, I'm going to put you under, you're going to be dreamless sleep or a coma for 5 years, would you let them do it? What about 20, right? If we have a pandemic year like we have recently, a lot of us might be tempted to sleep an entire year away. But normally, we would say no. We would find that horrifying, right? And why is that? Why would you not want to let someone put you under for 5 years or 20? I mean, for one thing, if you're in a coma and you're not moving around, all kinds of bad things happen to you. It's not by any stretch of the imagination good for the body. When you wake up, things are going to be messed up. But even if that weren't the case, you would probably be upset because you would think, oh my goodness, this 5 or 20 or however many years I'm asleep or I'm unconscious, think of all the things I'm going to miss, right? And if you were aging normally, it's 5 years of your life gone. You could have been having all these great experiences, doing fun stuff, and it's just gone. Not only does that seem to me something that we should fear, it seems completely horrifying, right? I don't know about you guys, when I was in elementary school, they read us the story of Rip Van Winkle, right? And everybody's like, ha ha, he sleeps for, was it like 50 years? Isn't this a funny, fun story, kids? And it scared me senseless. I was horrified at this story. I'm like, oh, the dude's whole life is just gone and he's old now. His whole life is basically stolen from him. I mean, I guess the story's supposed to be moralizing that Rip was really lazy anyway, whatever. Maybe you're supposed to learn some lesson about sleeping your life away. But, my first grade, maybe kindergarten teacher read us this story, and it was supposed to be fun time, happy, just not terribly serious story, and it horrified me. And I'm like, I was just, even as like a 6-year-old, I'm like, why are you not horrified by this? This is terrifying. So anyway, yeah, when these periods of unconsciousness become a very long time, I think we would say to Socrates, well, then they start to look pretty bad. The thing about death is it's not 5, 10, 20 years, it's forever. If the periods of unconsciousness of long duration are scary, death is that scaled up infinitely, right? So if they're scary, it seems like, well, yes, death should be terrifying. Anyway, my point here is, to defend the premise if death is the end of experience, then is not a bad thing. We need something more than this analogy with dreamless sleep unconsciousness. Socrates might be right for very short periods of unconsciousness. But when it comes to longer periods, he seems to be wrong. Not only are they something that seems bad to us, they seem horrifying. At least they do to me. Maybe you have a different reaction, but to me, it's just terrifying. Well, anyway, in the next few lectures, I want to talk about the Epicurean Argument. And what's interesting about the Epicurean Argument, it picks up at the same point Socrates does, right? If death is the end of all experience, it is not bad for us. But it tries to give a different and I think more complicated and more interesting argument for this. Now, when we get down to it, I'm going to give the Epicurean argument a pretty hard time. I'm not convinced by the Epicurean argument either. But I do think there's some interesting stuff in the Epicurean argument because it'll make some claims about what is good for us, what is bad for us, what it is to harm or benefit us. And I think digging into these questions or digging into these assumptions raise some really, really interesting questions about what is good for people, what is bad for people. So, Epicurean argument, I think, interesting in and of itself, but I think these questions it raises as we put some pressure on it, even if we don't agree with the Epicureans, these are very fascinating and we can learn something from them, right? You're going to see that that's a common experience in philosophy. We might not be convinced by something, but in struggling with it, in explaining why we're not convinced, we might still learn something. That's one of the things I love about philosophy is even people you think are wrong, you can often learn a lot from.